Let me show you the math that makes Trump's 500% tariff threat extremely difficult to execute against China. At its recent peak, the U.S. imported over $425 billion worth of Chinese goods annually, and even with recent declines, the figure remains above $380 billion, everything from electronics to pharmaceuticals to machinery. A 500% tariff doesn't just hurt China, it makes those goods unaffordable for American consumers and businesses. Where does Walmart restock its shelves? Where does Apple get its components? Where do hospitals source critical pharmaceutical ingredients? The answer for now is predominantly China, and there's no realistic alternative at scale in the short to medium term. Beijing knows this arithmetic better than most in Washington acknowledge publicly. That's why when Lindsey threatens 500% tariffs, China's response isn't panic, it's patience. Let me explain why this threat may actually strengthen China's position. First, let me walk you through what the Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025 actually proposes, because the details matter enormously. Senator Lindsey Graham, along with Democratic co-sponsor Richard Blumenthal, has drafted legislation that would impose a 500% tariff on all goods and services imported from any country that knowingly purchases Russian oil, petroleum products, or uranium. The bill has 84 co-sponsors in the Senate, bipartisan support, and Trump has reportedly given it his blessing. As of this writing, Graham says a vote could happen as early as next week. The stated goal is to pressure China, India, and Brazil into abandoning Russian energy purchases. Graham frames this as giving Trump tremendous leverage against countries fueling Putin's war machine. The theory is simple: force these nations to choose between access to American markets and cheap Russian oil. Here's the challenge with that theory. It assumes America has more leverage than the economic realities may support. And against China specifically, the math creates serious problems for implementation. Let me break down the numbers that Beijing has almost certainly already calculated. China exports several $100 billion worth of goods to the United States annually. That sounds like massive exposure, and in absolute terms it is, but Chinese GDP is now over $18 trillion. Exports to America represent roughly 2 to 3% of China's total economic output. Significant, but not existential. Now flip the equation. America imports those hundreds of billions in Chinese goods because American consumers and businesses need them. We're talking about consumer electronics that fill Best Buy and Amazon warehouses, pharmaceutical ingredients that stock hospital pharmacies, industrial machinery that keeps factories running, solar panels, batteries, furniture, clothing, toys, auto parts. The list is essentially endless. A 500% tariff doesn't eliminate demand for these products. It makes them 6 times more expensive. That laptop that costs $1,000 now costs $6,000. That generic medication that costs $10 now costs $60. That washing machine that costs $800 now costs nearly $5,000. American consumers don't absorb that cost willingly. They either pay dramatically more, buy dramatically less, or find alternatives. And here's the critical point. For most of these product categories, there's no realistic alternative at comparable scale in the near term. Vietnam, Mexico, and India are growing as manufacturing alternatives, but the capacity gap remains substantial for complex supply chains. Let me give you a specific example. A dominant share of active pharmaceutical ingredients and antibiotics used in the U.S. healthcare system come from China and India. In some critical categories, dependence exceeds 70 to 80%. A 500% tariff on Chinese pharmaceutical exports would create serious shortages with real consequences for patient outcomes across the American healthcare system. Building domestic manufacturing capacity would take years and cost hundreds of billions. Beijing understands this vulnerability well. They've studied American supply chains carefully. When Graham threatens 500% tariffs, Chinese strategists likely don't see an immediate threat. They see a scenario where America would inflict significant damage on itself. Now let me explain why China's position on Russian oil is essentially non-negotiable, because this context matters for understanding their likely response. China imports roughly 11 million barrels of oil per day, making them the world's largest oil importer. Russia supplies approximately 2 million barrels of that daily total, around 18% of Chinese oil imports. More importantly, Russian oil comes at a significant discount, often $15 to $20 below market price due to Western sanctions that limit Russia's other buyers. The annual value of Chinese-Russian oil trade exceeds $80 billion, but the strategic value goes far beyond dollars. Russian oil arrives via pipeline directly into Chinese territory, bypassing the maritime choke points that American naval power could theoretically interdict during a conflict. The Strait of Malacca, through which most Middle Eastern oil reaches China, is a vulnerability that keeps Chinese military planners focused on alternatives. Russian pipeline oil addresses that vulnerability for a significant portion of Chinese energy needs. Asking China to abandon Russian oil isn't asking them to change a trade relationship. It's asking them to accept strategic vulnerability to potential American pressure. No government prioritizing long-term security would likely agree to this, regardless of tariff threats. And here's what makes the math even more challenging for Washington. If China did somehow reduce Russian oil purchases significantly, where would they get replacement supplies? The global oil market is already tight. Substantial Chinese demand shifting to other suppliers would put upward pressure on prices globally. American consumers could end up paying more at the pump, not less. The tariff designed to pressure China might end up pressuring American voters. Here's the part that most analysts in Washington acknowledge privately but rarely say publicly. Beijing has almost certainly calculated all of this. They likely assess that a 500% tariff threat faces serious implementation challenges because following through would be economically self-damaging for America. And they probably calculate that even if Washington moved forward, the result wouldn't be Chinese capitulation. It would be accelerated Chinese decoupling from the American economic system. Let me walk you through what that decoupling looks like, because this is China's actual strategic direction. For the past several years, China has been systematically reducing its vulnerability to American economic pressure. They've built the CIPS payment system as an alternative to SWIFT. They've accumulated gold reserves while reducing treasury holdings. They've developed domestic semiconductor manufacturing despite American restrictions. They've signed bilateral trade agreements with dozens of countries that allow settlement in yuan rather than dollars. Every American tariff escalation tends to accelerate this process. When Trump imposed 25% tariffs in 2018, China responded by diversifying export markets and building domestic consumption. When the Biden administration maintained those tariffs and added technology restrictions, China increased investment in self-sufficiency initiatives. Now a 500% tariff threat gives Beijing additional justification to accelerate what they were already planning. The likely result isn't Chinese economic collapse, it's Chinese economic independence from American leverage over time. Consider the rare earth situation. China controls around 60% of rare earth mining and close to 90% of processing capacity globally. These materials are essential for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to advanced weapon systems. America has limited domestic processing capacity. A trade war that escalates to the level Graham proposes would give China reason to consider restricting rare earth exports, not through tariffs, but through export controls of their own. America sanctioning Chinese goods is painful for China. China restricting rare earth exports would be severely disruptive for American technology and defense industries. This asymmetry is why some analysts question the credibility of the 500% threat. Now let me address the political dynamics, because Graham's bill likely serves multiple purposes beyond changing Chinese behavior. The Sanctioning Russia Act positions Republicans as tough on Russia, which helps address Democratic criticism about the administration being soft on Putin. It positions the administration as defending Ukraine without committing American troops or additional aid. It creates a talking point that sounds aggressive without requiring immediate implementation. Washington insiders recognize that China is unlikely to abandon Russian oil. The bill gives Trump authority to impose tariffs. It doesn't require him to actually do so. The threat itself becomes the policy, allowing Washington to claim leverage while preserving flexibility on implementation. Beijing almost certainly recognizes this dynamic. They've observed American tariff threats through multiple administrations. They've learned that dramatic announcements don't always translate into dramatic actions, and when they do, China has consistently adapted faster than Washington expected. The 2018-2020 trade war is instructive. Trump imposed escalating tariffs expecting Chinese concessions. Instead, Chinese exports to America remained more stable than predicted, while Chinese exports to the rest of the world grew substantially. The tariffs did hurt some Chinese manufacturers, but they also accelerated Chinese industrial upgrading and market diversification. The pattern Beijing has observed is that American tariff policy often involves more political signaling than sustained economic strategy. Threats generate headlines, implementation gets complicated, and over time China tends to emerge more resilient from each confrontation. So what actually happens if Graham's bill passes and Trump decides to implement 500% tariffs? Scenario 1, China retaliates proportionally, imposing equivalent restrictions on American exports. Boeing faces serious challenges with its largest international customer. American farmers lose access to the world's biggest agricultural market. Tech companies lose manufacturing partners that are difficult to replace quickly. The American economy faces significant headwinds, and politically, sustaining the tariffs becomes challenging. Scenario 2, China retaliates asymmetrically, considering restrictions on exports of rare earths, pharmaceutical ingredients, and critical components where American alternatives are limited. American industries face supply chain disruptions. Defense production encounters challenges. Consumer prices rise. The 500% tariff becomes politically difficult to maintain. Scenario 3, China doesn't retaliate dramatically, but instead accelerates long-term decoupling. They potentially reroute Russian oil purchases through intermediaries to technically address the law while changing little substantively. They deepen economic ties with Europe, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. They build parallel systems that reduce American leverage over time. In 5 years, Washington may find that its economic pressure tools have become less effective. My assessment is some combination of scenarios 2 and 3 is most likely. China would probably retaliate enough to demonstrate that American pressure has costs, while focusing primarily on strategic decoupling that reduces future American leverage. The 500% tariff may not change Chinese behavior on Russian oil. It may change China's commitment to reducing American economic reach over their economy. What does this mean for you as someone trying to understand global economic dynamics? First, recognize that tariff threats against China have historically struggled to achieve stated objectives. There's reason to question whether this one will be different. Political rhetoric about leverage doesn't always translate into behavioral change by Beijing. Second, understand that escalating trade conflicts tend to accelerate de-dollarization. Every American sanction or tariff gives China and other nations additional motivation to build alternatives to dollar-dominated systems. The long-term consequence may be reduced American financial leverage, not enhanced. Third, watch for Chinese responses on strategic commodities. If tensions escalate, rare earth restrictions, pharmaceutical export considerations, and supply chain disruptions become increasingly relevant. American supply chains have vulnerabilities that deserve attention. The 500% tariff threat makes for compelling headlines. Senator Graham positions himself as tough on Russia and China simultaneously. The administration projects strength without committing to immediate action. But the underlying math creates real implementation challenges. America's supply chain dependence on Chinese goods remains substantial. Chinese energy security considerations make Russian oil strategically important, and Beijing has been preparing for this kind of confrontation for years. When you understand the numbers, you understand why China is unlikely to change course based on this threat. The leverage Washington claims may be more limited than the rhetoric suggests, and time may favor Beijing's patient approach more than Washington's dramatic announcements. So tell me this. Do you think Trump will actually implement 500% tariffs, or is this primarily negotiating positioning? And if tensions do escalate, how might it reshape global supply chains and trade relationships over the next decade? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this confrontation will likely define U.S. China relations for years to come. The math creates constraints that political rhetoric can't easily overcome. Understanding those constraints is essential for anyone watching global markets. If this analysis helped you see the economic realities beneath the political theater, make sure you subscribe. I'll be tracking every development in this tariff situation and what it means for global trade, supply chains, and the evolving relationship between the world's two largest economies.